Awesome. Thank you for such a kind introduction. I'm actually moving into a new position at our studio as of early February. I'm product manager for data science communications. So I appreciate the shout out for the improvements and features and documentation. That's part of what I hope to keep doing at our studio and make the ecosystem around R Markdown and data science communication, sharing, collaboration a little bit easier to access for people, a little bit more consistent across our packages. And we're kind of aiming to turn those, problems that you think shouldn't be a big problem for you that end up being 6-hour problems. We're trying to kind of scope it down a little bit. So maybe like, at the low end, I'd like to have a 2-hour problem instead of a 6-hour problem. So we're pretty excited about the stuff that we're working on. And today what I wanted to share was some kind of newer things on the horizon. Some of them are still like in development packages. Some of them aren't developed by our studio, but actually one of our team members now is Garrick Aidenbury, who we're really lucky to have because he does such amazing work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of his packages that's currently only available on GitHub, but I think it's really a step forward for people who use R Markdown to be able to start building reports that actually have like programmatic text in the report itself. So that was always like sort of a little bit of a hard nut for me to crack when I was working on my research studies, was trying to figure out how to get some values from my R code into the text and how to format them nicely. And I think some of the packages that I'll talk about today might hopefully change your mind about that and see a new way of doing that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. So I previously done this talk last month on Valentine's Day. So that's why the Valentine's theme. And I'm sort of known for having like a slide theme. So I kind of can't do a slide deck now at this point without having some kind of theme to get me through so that I can keep myself engaged while I'm developing. So the title of my talk is Made with YAML, Strings, and Glue, Making R Markdown Work Better for You, which is, I think somebody on your organizing team came up with that title, which was nice because mine was an R Markdown Valentine for you, but then it didn't make sense in March. So we're going to talk a little bit about basically how to get programmatic text into your R Markdown, which has to do with strings, glue, and then I'm going to pull YAML in as well because I think it's really, really useful if you're using parameters to make an R Markdown parameterized report. And this was one of those topics that I hear a lot of people in the community saying that they're not quite sure if they need parameterized reports, what kind of problems do parameterized reports solve? So I'll talk a little bit about that too, because I think it's an interesting problem. And I think there are just certain groups of people that will feel that parameter pain and some that may not need them. But when you need them, they're there for you. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of a beginner approach to that. So hello. My name is Alison Hill. As I mentioned, I'm product manager of data science communication at our studio. A lot of my work is up open source on GitHub and my personal account, but a lot of my contributions are also in the RStudio org under various repositories. I try to stay pretty active on Twitter. That's my best way of sometimes getting bug reports as they come in when we push things to development versions of packages. But it's also one of the ways that I really try to stay engaged and see what are the use cases around R Markdown for our user base. So I really love seeing what people are making with R Markdown, but also hearing about pain points and workflows. I have a website currently, alison.rbind.io. I'm in the process of doing a Hugo switch there. It's a blog down site. So expect in the next week or so to see a brand new site there, hopefully with a slightly better workflow for myself since it's a blog down Hugo theme. My site was previously built with Hugo Academic. So if anybody here has tried to crack that nut, I am moving on beyond it because I can no longer build anymore with the new Hugo additions that Academic brought. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about building some Valentines. And I'm going to use this data set that I've been curating for a little bit that is not yet on CRAN. So you can install it from GitHub, but you don't have to for this talk. It's mainly my way of getting some names of people to send Valentines to. So you can check out the website here and you can install it from GitHub if you'd like to follow along. but I'm going to use it to knit some valentines. And then I also have a repository here in my personal GitHub, Baker Valentines, and you can see kind of some of the source code. I'll be showing you snippets of YAML and some snippets from scripts to actually render the valentines, but you can go ahead and go there and check it out. So with R Markdown, one of the cool things that many people focus on are the output formats. So this is kind of our new R Markdown spirit animal hedgehog. You can knit to almost any kind of output format that you'd want. And this is a really useful feature of R Markdown to be able to make slides, dashboards, websites, single HTML pages, LaTeX documents, Word, PDF, even books. But there's the output formats, and then there's the stuff that goes actually into the R Markdown report. And both of those places actually have a lot of like kind of features for innovation there. One of those is a package by Jim Hester, actually, which is Glue. And Glue is a really, really nice package for being able to work with strings in R. And I really like the interface for it. And so I'm going to start there because I think Glue can be a really powerful thing inside an R Markdown report, whatever your output format is, because it's rendered with R code. So one thing that was sort of an aha moment for me was to be able to use Glue within a code chunk to be able to print some things nicely from my R code. So in this code chunk that I'm showing you here, I've got results being rendered as is. I'm not echoing the actual code here, but my code chunk starts with bakers, which is a small data set of some of the bakers from the Great British Bake Off. And I'm using the count function to count by series. And then I'm using the glue underscore data function to be able to do a little bit of nice gluing of these character strings together with variables. So from the count series function right above it, I'm getting out a variable called n, which is the number of rows that it counted by series. So I'll have a variable called series and a variable called n here. And by using this combination of glue underscore data and glue underscore collapse, what you would see rendered in my document is a series of bullets like this, where it would go through all 10 series from the Great British Bake Off, and it would count up the number of bakers per series. So you could really quickly see, in kind of a nice text formatted way, that we had, up to only at series 4 did we start having like a baker's dozen number of bakers, and then it kind of rounded out to 12. Series 10 had 13 bakers also. And this is obviously something you could also do in a table. There's a lot of different ways that you could present this kind of information. But the real cool thing about being able to use glue in code chunks like this is that your reader doesn't even know that it's code. So it's sort of like this sort of secret weapon that you have to be able to make your documents more reproducible, because a lot of times we're wanting to summarize just some basic numbers about a data set that we're reporting on. And this was often kind of a hard thing for me to do and have it nicely formatted. So the combination of glue underscore data and glue underscore collapse, the collapse gives me the nice line breaks there between the different bullet points. That's kind of like a really nice entry level, I think, to being able to start entering programmatic text into your R Markdown document. You can also use glue code inline. And so this can kind of get a little long with inline code. But here I will type out a sentence that starts with the show has aired on, and then you can see the sort of signature single backtick in R that tells you that I'm about to start some inline code. And then I'm kind of wrapping it all up into this kind of longer sequence of code where I'm doing glue collapse. I'm taking the unique series channel, and I'm separating them with commas, and the last one is going to have an and so that it's an Oxford comma. It can get a little bit long when you actually try to have R write your English for you, right? But what you actually see when you render that is a nice sentence that people wouldn't necessarily, again, know is rendered from R code. So the show has aired on BBC 2, BBC 1, and Channel 4. So you can see I have my nice little Oxford comma in there. So things like that are really, really nice for being able to make documents that if the source code changes, if anything changes in your document, you don't have to painstakingly go through word for word and catch all those silly little typos that you might have made because your assumptions were based on the data in its original form. So I've used glue a lot in my own research and then in my work since joining our studio to be able to make my R Markdown documents work better for me, save me some time. And then I discovered this package that Garrick Aiden-Buie has been working on called Epoxy. So Epoxy is like leveling up your glue game by a lot. So this one is only available on GitHub right now. And what I like about demoing this right now is because it's also using a new feature of knitr, which is that Garrick has written basically an engine for knitr. And so I'm going to show you what this looks like, but it's a really nice user interface, I think, for being able to write programmatic text. So the package is named Epoxy. You'd need to install it from GitHub to use it currently. But Epoxy is going to give knitr a new engine that we can work with. And this helps us meld our data and text in a whole new way. And I'm going to show you how it looks different. So now I can actually have a chunk of text that includes code from R, but I'm not in an R code chunk anymore. I'm in a glue chunk. So you can see that here, instead of having that R engine in between the curly braces, I have glue. And then I just start writing text, which is kind of a nice thing, right? I can just start writing my normal sentence and then, oh, I want to plop a variable in. It goes in between the curly braces. And you can see that here I'm counting the number of rows in a data set in the bake-off package called series. So there are so many series of the Great British Bake Off, or GBBO, and you can see that I'm also showing you that you can write with Markdown formatting as well in these chunks, and then it will render. So that's what you would code. That would be like baby's first glue engine. And what you'd see is there are 10 series of the Great British Bake Off, or GBBO. And I think this is a really nice way to write, actually. At first, I was a little bit torn between having my narrative text in code chunks and having that look gray in my IDE and kind of the mixing of the two. But from a user standpoint, I think this is actually a lot easier to write than inline code. And the fact that it automatically gives you the Markdown formatting, it's really nice because it helps me think first in the sentence and then plop in the variables later. Whereas before, when I was writing with inline code, it would really take me away from the language of what I was trying to say, and it would make me think in R and then try to translate R back into English. This kind of lets me start in English and then add the RN, which I find is a little bit easier workflow. So I thought that was pretty exciting. And then as I started reading through the documentation that Garrick has put together, which is, as usual for him, is, you know, spectacular and completely got me going without needing to even ping him once. You can also add data, which is pretty cool. So here I am giving a data argument equals series, for example, and then you can use these transformers, which are similar to transformers in the glue package. You can add these transformers, and here I'm doing like epoxy style collapse, and you can look at all of his documentation to see what epoxy style collapse does. I'll show you what this looks like in a second, but then you can see that it says the show has aired on unique channel, and then there's this and there. That tells it how the vectors are collapsed by adding either an asterisk, an and, or the pipe to the end of the expression. And then what you can see is that that gives me that nice BBC2, BBC1, and Channel 4 collapse. So the show has aired on, and then here I'm pulling series up into the actual knitr, it's a knitr code chunk option, but it's a glue chunk. So you're declaring the series there, and then from there you don't even have to worry about what the data frame is. You can tell it what the data frame is, and then you can just refer to all the variables in your text. So I think this is a pretty cool package, and I think it really is a nice user-friendly way if you want to get really creative with being able to actually write text based on data in your R Markdown documents. I think it's a really nice one to try out and see what you think about having these new knitr engines. There's actually quite a few knitr engines that have been developed recently, and all the use cases are pretty fascinating. So we're hoping to see more of those, but this is definitely a very cool one and a nice one to show off how you can do this. You can also make this the Oxford comma way. So I did have to ping Garrett for this. So here you have to do epoxy style collapse last and, so you have to include that, but then you can get your Oxford comma. Hopefully we'll make it the default someday, the Oxford comma, but sometimes you have to work for it. But this is really nice if you can think about a data set maybe that you have where you have levels of a factor, you know, anything that's less than 5 usually, you often want to summarize in text rather than in a table. And so being able to list them out like this is a really nice feature. So anything like this, being able to put them together in a way that your reader doesn't necessarily know that code wrote them, but you can also go back and read them in a little bit better, formatting than I find our inline code. Our inline code to me is a little bit hard to debug sometimes. This is a little bit cleaner to me. And Epoxy is vectorized also. So I'm going to finally move my zoom controls because it's blocking. There we go. Epoxy is vectorized. So here I'm showing you taking that Baker's data set and I'm counting by series so that you can see that I have 1 row per series. Series went from 1 through 10. So I have 1 row per series, and then the N is the number of rows that it counted per series. So these are the number of Bakers. So this is what the data looks like. And what you would code is glue with data set to Bakers, and I'm piping that to count series. And then this is me recreating exactly what you saw at the very beginning when I used the combination of glue underscore data and glue underscore collapse. So here I've got a bullet point and I'm saying series, and then insert the number of series that we're on, and then show the number of Bakers. So then what you would see is series 1, 10 Bakers, series 2, 12 Bakers, etc. So that's a really, really neat feature. And just this amount of code, it's a lot easier and quicker. Once I started working with Epoxy, it was a lot easier and quicker for me to remember than a lot of the other incantations that I've used before. So I'm really excited to see where this package goes. And I hope that Garrick will continue to nurture it a little bit more and get it onto CRAN so that people can really find out about it. But I encourage you to test it out and try it if this has been a pain point for you in your R Markdown development. So you might be thinking, I kind of teased about parameters. What about parameters? How might these come into the story? So when I first saw this package Epoxy and I started thinking about use cases, I was like, oh man, this would be really, really nice for being able to make a parameterized report. So I'm going to real quick give you an overview. I'm moving my screen, my images again. I'm on a very small laptop screen, so no matter where I go, there's something blocking something. So if you haven't worked with R Markdown parameters before, this is going to be like the biggest in a nutshell I can do for R Markdown parameters. So I think of the parameters as a 2-step process. So the parameters 2-step. So the first step is that you want to set up your YAML with params. And I'm showing you a slightly more complicated YAML here. So I have date, February 14th, that's a single value. But then I also have a nested parameter. So I have a send to parameter, and I have to do that extra value there, and first and last goes underneath it. So this is because I wanted to have first and last to be linked together when I called them. You don't have to do this. You could just define all of your parameters just like date here. And that's actually the way easier way to do this. I made it life harder on myself. But you can do this as well. So sometimes people want to do this when they have a variable like first and last name where they kind of go together, and you'd like to be able to specify them as a list. And there's really only one first that goes with one last, but you have them in 2 separate variables. But this is how you'd originally set up parameters in your YAML. So you have a top level YAML key called params, and then you list all the named parameters that you'd like. The name can be anything you want because you're essentially making a new R variable right there in your YAML. It needs to be indented under params, but you can make as many there as you want. So that's the first step. So now we have a parameter defined in our YAML. And then how you would actually use it in your text of your R Markdown document is you would call that variable by doing params $ blah. So params $ my key that I made up. So here, if I call params date, you can see it returns February 14th. If I ask for params send to, you can see that it gives me a list back. It gives me first and last, and params sent from gives me first and last Alison Hill. So this is the way that you would start building up an R Markdown document to be parameterized. So it's not enough just to declare them in the YAML. You have to actually change your code to be able to use those parameterized variables throughout. And the benefit of this is that when you actually knit in the IDE in the most naive way possible, hitting the knit button, your report will render. It will render with the default values that you put in your YAML. But in a second, I'm going to show you how you can actually override those and use rendering from the command line to change that. But the nice thing about this setup, the way it is, defining everything in the YAML, is that you do have default values so that you can test out your report. You can make sure that it actually knits in the most basic way without necessarily taking advantage of the fact that those are parameters. So you could also use the parameters in code. So here, for example, when I'm writing in line, I could say Valentine's Day is our params date, and it would show up as the value February 14th. You could also take the Baker results data frame, for example, and filter by the params send to first name and the params send to last name. So you can use parameters throughout your document and make it so that when it knits, it uses the defaults, but you can customize that. And you can also use encode with Epoxy. So this code that I'm showing you right here is built with the Epoxy knitr engine. Oops, there it is. So what you can see is the values that I used to make that code. So I had code chunks that were glue code chunks with data equals params to show you the sent to date, data equals params send to, and then I just combined first and last, and then params sent from first and last there. So by specifying the data at the beginning of the chunk, I can really easily call upon those parameters and print them out nicely in my document. And I think going back to like why parameters, why would you need them? I think there's really two main flavors of parameterized reports so far. And I'd be curious if anybody here has any experience with parameterized reports and has any other flavors to add to the mix. But the most basic versions that I've seen, the first one is scoped. So if I think about maybe a report made with a single source, but with different variants scoped for different audiences. In these kinds of reports, you might change some of the code, but keep the data. So for example, you might have a presentation that you make for one conference, knit from the same document that you also make for a lunch and learn, for example. So you might have some kind of filtering of different code for different audiences, but overall the data is the same. You've just kind of maybe made it a little bit simpler for one audience than the other. You've had some conditional code chunks being run, things like that. Another one is a filtered report. So that's what I think of when I think about a report made with a single source. But the data set is filtered to focus on a specific subsample or time period. So in this case, you actually want to change the data, and usually that happens pretty early in the report, like you'll do an immediate filter, something like that. And then you'll keep all the code the same. So this might be something if you had like, data on, COVID infections, for example, or COVID recoveries, you might have one for the Pacific Northwest region in August. You might have one for the Southeast in July. All of these might take the same data coming in, but one of the early statements might be filter for these things that are in the parameter. Like maybe you have region equals PNW or region equals SC. Time period equals August, July, things like that. And so those are kind of the two main reasons that I think parameterized reports get popular. I actually use parameterized reports sort of differently. I use them sometimes mainly just to be able to reuse documents and find the metadata easier for them. So sometimes, for example, if I do a presentation and I'll have like the Wi-Fi name and password on like a slide, five slides into my deck. And if I go do another presentation, I want to copy that, but I want to be able to just really quickly change that. So I'll put in the parameters like Wi-Fi name, Wi-Fi password, and then just call the string later. So I use parameters sometimes in dumb ways, but you can really do them in very powerful ways as well. I just mainly do it to raise up some variables so that they're not lost in my document, because for me, they are kind of metadata. They're sort of things that I want to change for a new event or a new thing that I'm working on, and I sometimes forget that those things are hard coded in there. And what I've also seen is that there's two main modes for rendering parameterized reports. So when you have these either scoped or filtered reports, a lot of times people are trying to do just a single parameterized report. Like they may just want to render one at a time. And for rendering a parameterized report one at a time, you can just use the vanilla knit button, which is one of the neat features in the RStudio IDE. You can also build up in your YAML a way to have a Shiny interactive interface. So it's actually built off of Shiny, and you're using Shiny locally, but it's not necessarily Shiny the way you think of it. It's mainly giving you access to drop-down buttons, radios, sliders, things like that. But you can imagine that for some inputs for a parameterized report, let's say that you wanted to ask people about, you know, maybe which days in August do you want to know about COVID infection rates? If you had a slider or something like that kind of input, you could have them go from 1 to 15, things like that. There's nice inputs there. So it doesn't all have to be just text-based input. So this really allows you to share a parameterized report with somebody else, but they'd still have to know RStudio and the IDE to be able to knit with that interface. And a lot of people seem to prefer the command line as well, and you can do that too. I'll show you mainly examples of doing that. The other way that I've seen that seems to be popular for certain enterprise groups is what I think of as like batch parameterized reports. So this is where when you want to iterate across all values of a parameter, and you want to be able to really quickly create, like, you know, maybe a report card for every state's education system, or a COVID report card for every county in the state. Things like that. So they're usually combined with filtered reports in my experience, when you do this kind of batch reporting mode. And for this, you can use the command line. You can customize the knit button, and I'm going to show you how to do that. I don't totally recommend it, and I'm not entirely confident it's a good workflow, but I'll show you how to do it. And we're considering making that a little bit easier on the R Markdown team. So this would be my kind of grand params finale of how to do all of these different kinds of rendering modes for parameterized reports. So we know that parameters flow down by affecting the code and text in the body of the documents. That's what we've really kind of talked about so far, is being able to use parameters in the YAML and have that show up in the text in your document. So that's kind of a natural flow. I think that's a really intuitive way to think about it. You've got this data in your YAML and it's flowing down, and that's normally how your R Markdown works. When you've got, you know, rendering from top to bottom, that's how your code chunks work. So that kind of fits with everybody's mental model of R Markdown. But what you can also do is have your parameters flow up to your YAML. So you can change your file output names and your document's metadata. And these are actually really useful when you're working with parameters, because a lot of times if you're doing some kind of batch reporting or things like that, you'd often want to change the file output names, or you'd want to change the document's metadata when you're doing the rendering. It's often not enough to just do the batch rendering. You need to be able to also monkey with those things. So I'm going to talk now about how to kind of get those parameters to flow up. So you can use parameters inside your YAML fields. So here I'm defining my parameters the exact same way as I started with, where I had these parameters for date and a send to, which was a list of first and last, and sent from, which was a list of first and last. And you can see that in my title now, I'm actually using the parameters, using just plain inline code for here. So a Valentine for, and then using plain inline code, R param send to first, and then the subtitle is yours truly, R param sent from first. So this would render with a Valentine for Annetta, yours truly, Alison. So if we wanted to use these params inside an R Markdown render call, we would need to get a little bit fancy. You can do for loops. I kind of prefer to use the per package for this because it's a little bit more readable to me, but to each their own. Everybody has their own workflows and neither one of them is wrong here. I tend to use perwalk. Other people use different functions. Perwalk is basically a version of map, but allows you to get the side effect and not see a bunch of stuff print to your console. And that's really the only difference. You could also use map as well, but it prints a bunch of stuff to your console that I don't need for this, because all I care about is the files that it's making. So here in this call to perwalk, I'm giving it a list as input. So you can see here that instead of sending this Valentine to Annetta Mills, I'm going to now send it to Sophie Faldo. So send to is a list. The first name is Sophie and the last name is Faldo. So I'm providing that as input. And I'm going to walk across that list with our Markdown render. And I'm going to take this input that's, my input is called index.rmd, but whatever your file name is, that's what would go here. And then the key here is to have the output file argument with, here I'm using glue. So you can actually use glue to do this as well. And I find it a little bit easier for me to maintain this kind of code if I use glue. So here I'm gluing together Valentine for, and then X first. So .x is my send to list. So that should read Valentine for Sophie.html. And I'm also changing an output option here. And so this is something that's not pulling from anywhere else, but just to show you that you can change anything that's an output option in your YAML typically. Anything that our Markdown render knows about, any argument, you can change. So in my Baker Valentine's repository, I think I set in my parameter the Flatly theme, for example, so you can override that here in the Markdown render call. And when you're testing out parameters, it's kind of fun to do this because then it's a really nice visual check immediately that your parameters have kicked in. So if it looks really different, the font's different, it's kind of a nice like feeling when you get it right and you got it going. So that's the script. But that script there would actually not replace any, that would not actually change the Valentine itself. That would change just the output file and the journal name. It would actually wouldn't affect my parameters at all. So what I'd have to do to actually make that happen is to add this one other line, which is params. So our Markdown render takes as argument params. And for that, I would give it a list and call it send to and give it this .x list as input. So now this would mean that the actual inner part of that Valentine would say to Sophie Faldo. If I had knitted it before without that params there, it would have just changed the name of the file and changed the theme, but it would have still said a Valentine for Annetta. And you can replace anything that's a parameter. So here I'm adding one more parameter to my R Markdown render. So it's the same code as I showed you before, but now I'm adding a sent from list. And this one I'm not trying to give as input. I'm just going to kind of call it statically. A list is, the first name is going to be from Paul Hollywood. So that's the new sent from. So that will overwrite that the Valentine was originally from me. So now we've got a Valentine that we've built off of the original that I wrote to Annetta Mills, but it'll be addressed to Sophie Faldo from Paul Hollywood. And you can also use parameters to replace YAML fields. So if you go into my Baker Valentine's repository, you'll see a render underscore single.r. And that's the script that I would use to do this. So in step one, you could have, for example, a params variable that you add called my underscore Valentine. And here the value of it is nothing matters. So it's a depressing Valentine. And then I'd make my title dependent on that. So now my title is completely dynamic based on a parameter that I've defined. So params my Valentine. And then in step two, here I could just completely replace that and say, forget what I just said, make the title my funny Valentine. So by passing this parameter my Valentine, I'm able to overwrite that. And the reason you have to do this two-step procedure here is because title is not an argument to our Markdown render. Our Markdown render doesn't know about title as an argument. So you have to make title something that it knows about. And the only way to do that is because parameters are involved. So you can kind of weld parameters to make them change some of the R Markdown documents metadata that you wouldn't normally be able to impact. So it's kind of a nice workaround for being able to do that. So in this example, the title would be My Funny Valentine, the file name would be Valentine for Sophie, the theme would be journal, and it would be from Paul Hollywood. But all of that stuff is not matching at all what is in my YAML anymore. Oops. Okay, so we've talked a lot about using YAML with strings and glue. We talked about using params inside YAML fields to make them kind of more dynamic YAML. We've used params inside our Markdown render to make it a dynamic render. And if you had code, programmatic text written that was depending on those parameters, they all flow through the entire document. And we've talked about using parameters to replace parameter values so that you can have dynamic parameter values. So these are all kind of slightly different things, and they're usually just kind of one little change here, one little change there, but it's a little hard to organize sometimes. So hopefully if you go to the repository that I shared with you earlier, you'll be able to walk through some of those render scripts and see how they work. And then we also just talked about using parameters to replace YAML fields. So that's the dynamic metadata, the idea of being able to change the title, for example, and make it different for every single one of them. So the final thing that I wanted to show you is how to do an actual batch render. So this is the script in my repository _render_batch. So here I'm using dplyr. I'm reading in a data set of Baker names, and I'm mutating to make the send to value a list now of first and last names. So that's my setup. The data looks like this. So if I took that data frame that I just made, you can see that here are all the people now I want to send it to. So instead of just sending it to one, instead of sending Valentine's to just single people, now I've got a list of 6 that I want to send to, 6 first and last names. So with that setup, I can use the same code with perwalk, give it the baker names data frame with send to list as the input. And you can see that I haven't changed anything else. I've changed mainly that. And so instead of just giving it a single value before, I was overwriting Annetta Mills with Sophie Faldo. Now I'm overwriting it with 6 possible values and iterating across all of those. And this is kind of a cool thing. If you run the render batch in my repository, it's kind of fun when you start seeing all the Valentines popping up. I'm going to skip this part, dynamic parameter fields, because I feel like it's a little bit more advanced and I don't want to totally overwhelm you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to showing you the actual repository and see, let's see. And again, I'm trapped in my slides. Hold on. There we go. It's always weird when you hit escape and nothing happens on your computer and you're just like, you're in this like slide box. You can't get out. Okay. So here, this is my repository, Baker Valentines. I'm going to remove all the Valentines here real quick so you can see them all fresh.
You still see your slides? So did you?
Oh, shoot. Okay, perfect.
When you share your desktop, you can unshare.
Let me do that. Yeah. Thank you for that. Let's see. Let me see where I'm at.
And I'll throw the link in the chat too if people want to go to the.
Yeah, perfect. There we go. Okay, so now I'm in the right one. Okay. So I'm going to just restart just so I have a really fresh session. Okay. So this is my single Valentine that I start with. That's the file in there. It's index.rmd. And you can see the title says, a Valentine for, and I've got the parameters there. And yours truly, the date is dynamic here. And then I've also got it set to be HTML document theme flatly. Now I have this thing that I haven't shown you here yet, and this is how you actually customize the knit button to make it run when you hit the knit button to use one of your scripts that's in the same directory as your file. I don't know that I totally recommend this, but it helped me. So I'm going to comment that out real quick and hit save and then just show you what this document looks like when I knit it. So when I knit it, just like in the most naive, basic way, what I got is all the default values that are in the YAML. So let me again move my screen around. So you can see that it tells me it's a Valentine for Annetta, yours truly, Mary. So I have it from Mary Berry right now. It has the date. It says to Annetta Mills from Annetta Berry. So all of this is from these glue code chunks here, these glue engine chunks. So it says to, that's what you're seeing there. And then from, that's what you're seeing there. And then I wrote like a little poem for Annetta. So Baker, Baker, you baked your heart out. You were Star Baker this many times. We met on this first date you appeared. After X many episodes, we said our goodbyes. So you can see that she won Star Baker 0 times. She was only on 2 episodes. Your showstoppers really blew us away. So here with this one single code chunk, taking your bakes as the data set, and this is a filtered report. So I basically filtered by the baker name using the parameter. So here, your showstoppers really blew us away. So you can see she made pink swirl macarons. Your signature bakes, we want one every Sunday. Light Jamaican black cake, rose petal shortbread. You brought us great joy. We'll miss you. It's true. Please keep on baking. Without your bakes, we'd be blue. And then at the end, I have a little call to R Markdown metadata. So you can see everything that's being read in by the file. So it's kind of a nice way to check yourself and see what's happening, what it thinks is in the YAML versus what it's rendering with. So this is, again, the most naive knit. So I'm just knitting actually right now. So let's see if I can change this. I'm going to open up a render single. So this is my function for being able to render a single one, where I'm going to now send it to Sophie Faldo. And I'm going to send it from Paul Hollywood. And instead of saying a Valentine for Annetta, it should say my funny Valentine. Oh, no, I didn't make the title dynamic here. So if I make the title dynamic here, I think if I do our params, my Valentine. We should see it say my funny Valentine instead of nothing matters. So I'm going to uncomment that knit, oops, so that it actually uses that. You can see it rendering down below. And you can see I also, in that render single, I also had it change the theme to journal. So you can see immediately that something changed. And now it says, my funny Valentine, yours truly, Paul, to Sophie Faldo from Paul Hollywood. Sophie, you baked your heart out. You were Star Baker 2 times. After 10 episodes, we said our goodbyes. Your showstoppers really blew us away. Looks like she made a lot of really interesting ones. Ode to Honeybee Entremet. And your signature bakes, we want one every Sunday. Looks like she made some really nice ones. And so you can see down here when you scroll down to our Markdown metadata, it doesn't actually render the params. It actually shows you what's actually in the YAML. And so you can see that it would have, had I knitted without this script, it would have thought it was Tuanetta Mills from Mary Berry, right? So those were the variables that it was seeing. So that's a render single. Then I'm going to switch to render batch. And so this is one where I am doing a little bit more work. So I'm creating this list of people to send the Valentine to. So let me see, I'll real quickly run this in my console just so I can pull it up to show you. Oops, I'm gonna need tidyverse. Oops. All right, let's go see the Valentines. Oops, that's not what I meant, B names. So here are all the different bakers that now I would like to send batch Valentines to. So Annetta, David, Edward, Jasminder, Jonathan, and Leah. So that's who I'm going to be sending it to. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So I'm going to change this here to render batch. And if I hit knit, I hope it works. Okay, let's go here. So you can see that what populated here, I've got all of my different Valentines. I can, oops, something's happening with my browser. There we go. Here's the one to Jasminder. Now I didn't override the my Valentine title, so they all say nothing matters. So it's a depressing Valentine. But I could have done that as well. I could have made it dependent on their name, my name, any of the parameters that I wanted it to be. And if I go back here, you can see that we'll open the one for Leah as well, so you can confirm that it was different. So move here. So they're both titled Nothing Matters. This is Nothing Matters Jasminder edition. So here she made like jaggery carrot and spiced condensed milk fruit tart as one of her showstoppers, whereas Leah didn't have as many. It looks like she.
Alison,
what?
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, again, sorry.
Gosh.
You have the option for desktop. Sometimes it doesn't give you that option.
No, now it does. It actually didn't before, but here, okay, so Nothing Matters. Here's the Jasminder edition. So you can see real quick, like there's a few little differences. She was on 5 episodes, for example. The Leah one, she was only on 1 episode. So you can see here all the different ones that I knit just by clicking on that render batch script. And there's a few other scripts in there as well that you can play around with, but hopefully this gave you some seeds for thinking about maybe how parameters and some of these new tools for being able to build up programmatic text could be useful in your workflows. I think there's a lot of exciting use cases for it, and I'm excited to see what other engines get built. I'm going to skip over this, as I mentioned. Oh, here's the trick for changing what the knit button does. So here, if you add your R script, and I recommend just kind of for good practice, calling it _render or something so that it's clear that it's a rendering script. But it must be of the form where it starts with function input. And then in your YAML, when you specify that knit key, you need to do this $ value. So you have to source your script, but then you also must end it with a $ value. But in that way, you can get the knit button to work, and it's kind of a nice little trick if you're testing this out pretty frequently. It's nice, but you can also still source the file in your workspace if it's in the if it's in the same directory as your document, then you should be fine. So I want to offer sincere thanks to all my RStudio colleagues, Jim Hester, who obviously developed the glue package, Christophe Dervaux, who is one of the engineers on the R Markdown team, and he was really helpful in helping me think through some of the parameterized report nuances. Garrick, obviously, for all of his development work, and Tom Mock, who helped with my my purring, because purring does not come naturally to Alison Hill. I need help with it. So, so I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes and answer any questions. I'm happy to talk about, what I talked about here or anything else related to R Markdown or RStudio. I'm open to any questions you all have. So maybe I'll stop sharing unless people,
Sure.
I'll go back if people have specific questions about slides.
All right. Thanks so much, Alison. That was great. People, if you want to throw a question in the chat, I can read it, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly, and I'll kick it off. When you do that batch script and it's multiple ones being built, does RStudio like open the last one? Does it open all of them? What happens when you...
I think it opens the last one, and I think it actually opens each of them in sequence, but you only see the last one, I believe.
I see. Oh, okay.
I think that's what I saw happen, but I actually can't say that now that you say that. Let me run it real quick and see again. I'm going to clear out my workspace real quick and see. Yeah, so you mean in the viewer pane when you do it?
In the viewer pane, or sometimes if you don't, I always don't mind the viewer, but sometimes you have that new the new window comes up. So does it open 10 windows, or does it just open
shows
one?
the first. It looks like it shows the first. So it just showed me a netta, but then it renders all the other ones down below.
Okay, great.
But I do have it set to send to the viewer pane. I don't have it set to do in browser window, so I don't know if it'd be different. I'll do it real quick while we're sitting here and see if I change that preference. I hope it doesn't open in all new windows, but let's tempt fate and see if I can really break things. Let's see. Okay, I'm doing the batch script. It still only opens a netta.
Okay, so always the first one. Okay, great. That's good.
Always the first one. Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of a really fun thing when you hit that batch script and it works and you start seeing all the output files coming through.
Right. That is nice.
But then there's this horrible feeling of, I think one of the first times somebody taught parameters to me, they didn't tell me about how to change the output file name. So in a workshop, I remember I was like, what is going on? And it was just cycling through and just saving over the file over and over and over again. So, at a minimum, change the output file name when you do that render script so that you can actually see the different versions. And then from there, you often want to change the metadata, like the title or things like that. But yeah, I remember thinking, what is going on? I'm doing this totally wrong, but it's the output file. And that's where glue is also really handy, because if you're having to programmatically specify the output file for every one of these, then it's a little tricky.
Hi, Alison.
Hi.
This is Alec. Thanks for the talk. I have to make use of parameters more often.
Oh, good. Excellent.
I was wondering, does the glue engine, or the epoxy engine, does that offer any more, like any strategies for, let's say you have a paragraph that you want to either like conditionally include or exclude. What does the epoxy engine offer anything to support that, or are there other strategies that you found work for that?
That's a good question. I was actually struggling with that right before we started, because I had a conditional code. I was trying to get a conditional glue chunk based on, another variable. So I was trying to create a variable that was like if it's from a group or not, and then have it eval only if that parameter was true. And I was having trouble getting it conditionally to include based on that. That said, that should generally work. So I was actually going to file an issue with Garrick about that. But yeah, generally, like, if you had any code, you can conditionally include with the knitr. You can make a variable and have eval or include be conditional on a true false or something like that. But yeah, it was giving me an error no matter what, even when it was set to eval to a value that was false. So so I think that might be coming. I assume Garrick knows how to fix that. He'll probably be speedy. But yeah, I think that would be cool.
Yeah, so just to clarify, you're in the eval argument of the code chunk, you're passing a variable. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
okay.
so let's see. Let me real quick share my screen just so you can see what where I stopped because I was running into errors, and I was like, oh no, I need to actually look at this a little bit more carefully before I figure out what's happening. But what I had done was I had this variable that I created is from group, and so that should have been true or false, whether that variable was missing or not. And then I had a glue chunk that I removed from this, but I had a glue chunk that was conditional on that had eval is from group like that. So you can generally do that. And if you had like a glue chunk that was using glue underscore data, glue underscore collapse, those kinds of things, you can definitely make those conditional on something else. And one of the first ways that I saw this like really in use was in Jenny Bryan's Stat 545 materials when we ported those to Bookdown. A lot of times at the beginning of every chapter, she had like a quick like, is it debug mode or not, basically. And then some of her chunks were set to be only, to only go if you marked debug mode was true, basically. And so it was a really nice way to see that. So I use that trick now pretty often. So it would be neat if the Epoxy engine respected those too.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm curious if anyone here has ever used parameterized reports or uses them in their work. John, do you have use cases for them when you're doing your workflow or package even? It seems like that might be something that comes up for you.
Unfortunately, it's not supported with Workflow R because I've had people ask, and I wish I could support it, but R really needs the HTML and R Markdown to be one-to-one. Someone's blowing up. I mean, I would have to have thought of it when I was making the package. I think it would have been hard.
But I guess for yours, it is more like you're making a website for a project. You're not really iterating.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's one of those things. Yeah, I wish I could support it, but it is hard because I would have to somehow know what they were I would have to know what the outputs were going to be to check for them. So, but I know people use them because they ask me about them. So people use them.
Yeah. There's some interesting use cases. I know, for example, the Urban Institute uses them to make like kind of iterated state fact report sheets, and there's a lot of like entities or organizations where you may do repeated reporting yourself for all these different entities, but each entity only wants to know their data. Like I only want to know the COVID data for my state or my county. I don't want to see everybody else's. So being able to make those kind of scoped, filtered reports based on that is really a nice feature. I think there's a great medium.com article that I believe was written by the Urban Institute about making like state driving fact sheets using our Markdown parameters. And that was a really nice walkthrough.
I agree. It's getting glitching hour here.
It's that time.
Right when I unmute myself.
Yeah. I know. I just heard my daughter come home. I'm like, if I suddenly mute myself, it's nighttime.
Emily, did you have a question?
No, I didn't have a question. That was a great talk. Thanks, Alison. I don't do a lot of iteration, so the parameter stuff is probably not super applicable to me, but I do tons of inline R code. So I have not heard of Epoxy, so that's really, really relevant to me for sure. I'm excited to try that out. I write a lot of like very unwieldy glue code inline, and so I think that's helped me a lot. So that was awesome.
It's kind of interesting because inline code is just really hard to debug because you can't run it the way it is. And right now we don't have like IDE support for being able to preview those chunks, like the little green buttons that you're used to for R code chunks go away. And I don't know exactly what that would look like if you even did support it. So it is a little bit of a black box. You kind of only see when it's knitted. But I found it as I started working with it, I was sort of like, oh, I don't know how I like putting my text in these gray code chunk blocks. But now that I've been working with it, I'm like, oh wow, it's so much easier for me to write. It's just, it was a lot easier for me to come back to the next week and be like, oh, right, that's what I did, instead of looking at this gobbledygook of, you know, all these backticks and nested things. And I'd be like, I have no idea what I was trying to accomplish here. And I had to knit to see it anyway.
Yeah, I'll end up with something that prints this tiny little thing, but it's like lines and lines and lines.
Yeah. And then like all you're getting out of it is like 3. Number 3.
So that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Looks like we have one hand raised. I can't quite see. Alec.
Yeah, I think it's Alec.
Oh, that was you, Alec. Was that before? Did I miss it before?
No, I was just waiting in case anyone else had.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I like the config package for you know, just configuration, right? And you write it, you know, you write a YAML file in the root, and you can have, you know, different subsets of configurations you want to use that may inherit, or that will inherit from like the default config. Now when you pass the parameters in to the R Markdown, like the batch rendering thing, I suppose like you could, it's just a list, right? You're just passing a list in. So so you could potentially just have one like giant configuration file and then pass in like, this is the params for this R Markdown document.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting use case. I think the lists are a little unwieldy to deal with, but I think you could definitely, you know, have that structure if you wanted to, and I could see that being kind of a nice workflow depending on your use case.
So I'll stick another one in there. So how hard is it to do that? I really like your slides where you can show the code and what it makes, like side by side. That's really slick. Is that easy? How hard was it to do that?
I should be like Garrick, Aiden Buey's booster officially, because I do this.
He doesn't have the Oxford comma by default.
I did, yeah. I messaged him and he was like, "Oh my god!"
Garrick before today, so.
So that is panel set from Garrick and Sure Engine Extra, and it's just like painfully easy. It's like just so easy and nice. So if you go to his demo here, he shows you, you know, these, and then I think there's an example where you can actually see there we go. So the previous slide looks something like this. So it looks like that. Yeah, I find it really, really nice for slides. Actually, that was another one where I was like, I don't know if that needs to work. Like, I don't know if we need tab sets in slides, but for showing code and an output in the same slide, so it's a little bit easier mentally to see it. You're not just like repeating the same slide, you know, back to back. I think it's pretty nice. Are you a Sure Engine user, or?
And not as much as I wish I was.
Yeah,
I should do more.
It's a haul. it's a commitment. It's a lifestyle. Once you've like learned it, life is easier. But I didn't feel totally confident in it for a while. But now that I have like my own CSS that I work with, it's a little bit more. It's more fun. So now I can only change a few things and be up and running. I also have a new rule for myself when I make slides that I do them like in a batch at like 4 hours, and that's it. Like it's done. And that's actually saved me a lot.
That's just probably a good practice in general. Yes.
There's just so much, you know, and it's a really easy, especially with like Garrick's cool packages and everybody's cool packages that add on to make Sure Engine slides awesome. There's like this feeling of wanting to like learn something new, but I'm trying to resist that. But panel sets was the one that I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm in for that. I'm in for panel sets.
It was worth it. It was worth it.
It was. That one is really nice. We're actually kind of considering putting more panel set type things in the other R Markdown formats as well. There's definitely a lot of really cool use cases for them, like in Distill and other output formats, Gitbook. It would be nice to be able to have those.
I have one last question, if I may. When you're passing values into the params argument for the R Markdown render function, do they need to be declared in the R Markdown file to work?
Okay, so you've now hit, now I have to go back to, now I got to show you the slides that I didn't want to show. So there is a way, I have a way, I will share it with you. I don't have it in the repository, but this actually came up in another talk. So it does seem like an interesting use case, and I'm curious to hear if there's anything you can share with me about what you're trying to accomplish. But I think of it as dynamic parameter fields. So so the use case that I've seen for it is people want to be able to pass some parameters to the render function, but they don't want to have to list them all painstakingly out in the YAML. So it might be that you might have a list of parameters that are generated from some other place. The use case I've seen is being able to use a Shiny app to like make a user selections and then use that to kind of batch render some parameterized reports for people. And so if you've already defined your parameters somewhere else, you don't really want to go back to the YAML and declare them all in there as well. So my answer to that is to create a parameter that's sort of a bucket that is just going to be a list. So I call it, there's no magic to this. I just called it input list. And you set it to null in the actual YAML, so that when you would knit, it would work just fine. Oh, and then I don't have the actual render. It's in, this was one where I'm still kind of troubleshooting exactly what I think is a great way to do this. I may not actually have the right code here, so I can't share it with you. Yeah, I don't have it in here the way I thought I did. But yeah, so then the idea is that you would pass that in the render. So you'd be able to pass it a list, and essentially all the R Markdown, can you guys see my screen right now that's actually showing the slides? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I don't see the green border right now, so I can't tell. So the idea is that the R Markdown YAML only knows about this one parameter. So it looks like one parameter, but if you pass it as a list and then you refer to them correctly, you know, a way that works in the actual code, then that would probably be the best way to go about that. Is that kind of your use case? Like you don't necessarily want it all in the YAML there, but you'd like to be able to pass it in?
Yeah, I didn't have anything in mind. Just
okay.
Just in case, you know, in case that could
just
be
imagining.
Useful. Right, right.
I'll say, let's see, it's mastering Shiny. So there's kind of this interesting part. I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it right away. Downloading reports. So where I have seen it come up is doing it in combination with this kind of workflow where you're generating our Markdown reports from like a Shiny app or something. And so if you had some selections that the user was making in the Shiny app, and you wouldn't necessarily want to have to go through and be like, okay, they, you know, there's this selection, this selection, this selection, all these possible parameters, you just dump them all in a single params and pass them there. This isn't exactly the link I was looking for when I was looking for this, so I might have to spelunk around and figure out where I'd seen that. But that's a definitely interesting use case. And I think in general, I have heard a lot of people saying, like, is there just basically any way to use parameters without relying so much on the YAML? Because some people find it less user-friendly. So I'm kind of curious now to think about your idea with the config package and see what that might look like with an external file.